Hi everyone, and welcome to another TGS English video. Today we're going to look at the poem War Photographer by Carol Ann Duffy, and it's Miss Medforth here taking you through this poem. So for today's session you will need some highlighters and pens and your poetry anthology. Now it may be that you're using a digital copy of the anthology, and that's absolutely fine, just make sure you're getting your annotations down. If we think back to our steps to success, the first thing that we need to do is read the title of the poem and explore the connotations. Here's our title of today's poem, War Photographer. I want you to pause the video now and consider the connotations of these two words. Okay, so war is quite an obvious one, and it links really clearly to our theme of conflict and also power. You might not have put the word photographer after war before. This might be something that you've not come across, but actually it's someone's profession to do this. So somebody is employed by the media to travel to war-torn countries and take pictures of what is happening there, and then we find them in our newspapers and on television as well. So we can imply that this poem will be about that job. Okay, so here are some examples of images, photographs that have been taken by a war photographer. So in this first one, we've got a conflict in Belfast in the 1980s, and you can see here a small child who is fleeing a dangerous scene. We've got the car on fire there. Second one is in Beirut in the 1980s, and we can see a mother and a child again fleeing a similarly dangerous scene. And finally, we've got two prisoners of war here being escorted somewhere by some soldiers, and this is Phnom Penh in the 1980s. Okay, now the reason that I've shown you these images is because the war photographer that we are going to be introduced to in our poem was taking images during this time period, and the poem was written in 1985. So we're really thinking about conflicts that were happening at this time. Now, what I'd like you to do is imagine that you are the war photographer taking these photographs that we've just seen. And I want you to pause the video and make some notes on the following questions. How do you feel? Explain your feelings in detail. And should you be doing something else other than taking the photo? And if so, why? Now, that was just really to get you to engage with the feelings of somebody who would have that job, and that's going to be important for when we read the poem. Before we start to read, it's really important that you understand how photographs used to be developed. So we're incredibly lucky that in the modern day we can snap a picture on our smartphone and we can instantly see it there in front of us. And this is very different to the past, where you'd have to wait for your photographs to be developed. When I was younger, this would involve taking the camera into somewhere like Boots and waiting about a week to get the pictures back. And you can imagine how excited you would be to see your pictures if you'd been on a holiday or something. So even before this, in the 1980s, when our poem is set, we would see a very different way of developing pictures. So here's our camera, and here's the film, which we call a spool of film. And the pictures would have to be developed in a dark room like this one. So you can see here the tray and the solution, and then hanging up the pictures to dry. You might have been in our photography room at school, and we actually do this. So you might have experienced this before, but it'll be unfamiliar to some of you. So it's important to understand what happens when developing a picture in the past. Next, on our steps to success, we are going to read the poem once and then again for meaning. And remember, it doesn't matter if you don't understand what's going on the first time, that's completely normal. It's just important that you try and understand the meaning and ask yourself those questions and think about what might be happening. I'm going to read the poem to you now, so if you can follow along in your anthology with me. War Photographer by Carol Ann Duffy. In his dark room, he is finally alone, with spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. The only light is red and softly glows, as though this were a church and he a priest, preparing to intone a mass. Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh, all flesh is grass. He has a job to do. Solutions slop in trays beneath his hands, which did not tremble then, though seem to now. Rural England, home again to ordinary pain which simple weather can dispel, to fields which don't explode beneath the feet of running children in a nightmare heat. Something is happening. A stranger's features faintly start to twist before his eyes, a half-formed ghost. He remembers the cries of this man's wife, how he sought approval without words, to do what someone must, and how the blood stained into foreign dust. 100 agonies in black and white, from which his editor will pick out 5 or 6 for Sunday's supplement. The reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. From the aeroplane, he stares impassively at where he earns his living, and they do not care. If we think back to our steps to success questions, I now want you to read through them and try and work out what is happening in this poem, so try and understand the meaning. If you pause the video now and attempt to answer some of these questions. It's time to check your understanding. The poem is actually about a war photographer, and it follows the thoughts of him and his recent return to England to publish photographs of conflict that he's taken abroad. So he's just got back. As he develops the photographs, he struggles to forget the suffering that he's seen. Finally, at the end, the photographer is frustrated with the public who view the photographs in the newspaper but do not truly care about the wars. He then boards an aeroplane to continue his job again. So this is really the story of how he develops his pictures and publishes them in the newspaper and then goes back off to war to do the same thing again. It's time to extend your understanding. So, as we've already said, the poem was published in 1985 by a woman called Carol Ann Duffy. Now, Duffy is our former poet laureate, and this might be something that you've not heard of before, but it's actually a poet's job to report on and write poems on things that are happening in our country. And they write those poems for the country and the monarchy. Now, you've already come across a poet laureate in the anthology because Tennyson was a previous poet laureate, and when he wrote The Charge of the Light Brigade, that was a poem for our country. And likewise, this was Duffy's job, and she's written a poem on Brexit and other topical things like that that affect our country. So she really has a shared understanding of the responsibility to translate experiences of people and potentially experiences of conflict. So whereas the war photographer does this through photographs, her responsibility is to do that through the written word. And she actually has a close friendship with a war photographer, and this poem was inspired by that friendship. It's time to start making some annotations. So as you're aware, we're just looking at 3 key parts of the poem, and we're looking for quality over quantity in our annotations here. The first annotation is, in his dark room, he's finally alone, with spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. I'd like you to pause the video now and make some of your own annotations based on the following questions on language, themes and ideas, poet intentions and context, and structure and form. It's really important that you make some of your own annotations before we go through it together. If we go through this together then and start with language, the first thing that we can pick up on is the phrase in his dark room. Now, literally, he's in the dark room publishing and developing his photographs, but this could be a metaphor for his mind and the fact that it might be dark and his thoughts might be dark. The darkness could also be symbolic of the evil of war. Further to this, it might be his own lack of morality. So what he's doing, he's going off to war, taking photographs, and then coming back to England and selling those photographs to the media. That's potentially not a very moral thing to do. So that might be quite dark in itself. The next phrase is finally alone. And we get the impression from the word finally that he's been desperate for this time. He's desperate to escape war. He's desperate to process his thoughts and what he's witnessed. Then we've got an example of a metaphor and sibilance in the phrase spools of suffering. So these films that he's taken out, that he's set in order, they're full of suffering. And the harsh S sound reminds us of the cruelness of the world. Imagery, so this idea that he set them out in ordered rows, it kind of reminds us of gravestones that are lined out in a cemetery, and it suggests that he's trying to create order after lack of control that he felt during the war, and he's trying to make sense of that. Again, this phrase, this idea that it's set out, implies it's quite methodical. He's doing this really carefully, and later in the stanza, he's compared to a priest. So it's almost like it's a religious service and he's honouring them. Moving on to structure, we have an example of enjambment. So you can see at the end of the line, there's no punctuation and it moves straight on to with. This implies that whilst he is literally alone in his dark room, he's not really, because with him is the suffering of the people inside the spool, so he actually just can't escape it. And just overall, we can see that the structure of this poem follows the journey of him developing the photographs, and the first part of this is laying out the spools in the dark room. Themes and ideas. The biggest theme in this poem is inner conflict, and it's this idea that he's struggling with the job that he's doing and the suffering that he's seen. So on the one hand, it's his job and he's got to be a war photographer. On the other hand, he's taking pictures of people who are suffering and not doing anything to help them. So he's torn between this. Poet's intentions. Duffy invites us to question the war photographer's morality. So the idea that he's making money, making a profit from this, she's inviting us as the reader to question his morality and the ethics behind what he's doing and whether it's right or wrong. Quotation 2. Something is happening. A stranger's features faintly start to twist before his eyes, a half-formed ghost. Again, I want you to pause the video now and make some initial annotations of your own. If we start with language, we've initially got this first sentence, something is happening. Now, to say the word something is incredibly vague and ambiguous, not specific about what is happening. Now, we know from this stanza that a photograph of a man who is implied that he's dead or he's dying is emerging. So that is something that is happening, but it's also possible that something's happening to the photographer in his mind, in his body, and he's having an emotional reaction to this. Then we get the word stranger, which is important because it implies that he doesn't get to know the names of the victims of war, but he does photograph them, which is incredibly personal. So again, we get this idea that he's not doing anything to help these people or get to know them, just taking the photographs for profit. There's this idea that the picture starts to twist before his eyes. Now, twist is quite a painful verb, which is suggesting that it's hard for him to see this image again, and it's bringing back the memories of when he was there. And finally, we've got this metaphor of a half-formed ghost. So the idea that a man is half-formed, it might suggest that a memory is slowly returning to him. It could be that this person was treated as a half, so not treated as a real person, just as a victim of war. Alternatively, it could be that a war photographer himself is half-formed, as in his inner conflict represents the two halves of him. So he's obliged to do his job, but he doesn't actually feel comfortable with it on the other half. And finally, this word ghost is implying that the man is haunting him, it's hovering around him, it's not leaving him alone, this man's not had, he's not been put to rest. Structure. So if we're thinking back to this journey of the photographs from being taken to being published, we're now focusing in on one particular photograph, a dying or potentially dead man. And we know from stanza 4 that there are 100 agonies. So the photographer's taken about 100 pictures of people suffering. And these people are nameless, they don't matter as individuals. But here, Duffy has really tried to focus us in on an individual and their family suffering. And she's trying to tell us that it's really important that we think about the individuals who are suffering from war. And finally, we've got the use of caesura after the word happening. And this pause indicates that he's fearful, he's anxious about seeing the picture forming, and he doesn't want to relive this moment. Themes. So a strong theme here is the idea of memory and guilt, and he's struggling to process the memory and feels guilt that he couldn't help this individual. Moving on to poet's intentions, Duffy really encourages us here to sympathise with the victims of wars, and she wants to expose the horror of war through this stanza. Now, she's deliberately not named a specific war, so we don't know if this photograph was taken in Beirut, Phnom Penh, Belfast, and this is purposeful and it creates a wider message for all conflicts and all people who are suffering around the world. Again, the photographer's morality is called into question. Should he have helped this man rather than taken a picture? And that's something that she wants the reader to question. Our final quotation, number 3, the reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. Again, I want you to pause the video now and make some of your own initial annotations on this quotation. Starting with language, the first two words, the readers. Now, this is a generic group from society, and Duffy's trying to tell us that as a group, society is quite uncaring. So readers are seeing the photographs in the newspapers, but they don't really care. and they're grouped together as a whole to show this. The use of the word eyeball, so that their eyeballs prick with tears, is quite an unusual phrase. We don't normally talk about our eyeballs, just our eyes, and it suggests it's quite a scientific, robotic response, and that they don't see it in the same way as the photographer. Because when the photographer saw the image, Duffy refers to his eyes rather than eyeballs. So we've got this idea that they're seeing things in different ways. The verb prick. So this is only a fleeting pain. So if you imagine that you prick your finger on a needle or a rose thorn, yeah, it hurts a little bit and you might draw a tiny bit of blood, but it's not very painful. It's not a huge amount of pain, and implies that the readers feel some sympathy for the war victims, but not very much. Then we've got the words bath, beers, lunch, and these lexical choices are reflective of the luxuries that these readers have. So on a Sunday, they get to have a nice bath, get to enjoy an alcoholic drink and have a nice lunch. And these are the things that Duffy is trying to highlight that people take for granted whilst people are suffering. And finally, the word between tells that this is just a time filler. So it's between having a bath and lunch. So it's not something that the readers are really taking time to look at. It's just a time filler until their next luxurious activity. Moving on to structure. So if we think about the journey of the photograph from being developed to being published, we're now at that stage where it's being published in the Sunday's supplement. We've also got the use of internal rhyme, so rhyming within the line of tears and beers. Now, these words are juxtaposed and it suggests that their emotion is only fleeting before they return to their Sunday entertainment. So readers have gone really quickly from being upset to enjoying a drink. Furthermore, we've got the use of enjambment, which suggests that a reader's Sunday is not being interrupted in any way by seeing these photographs. And we can compare this to the use of caesura when the photograph sees the image forming in stanza 3. So when he says something is happening, or when Duffy writes something is happening, we've got this idea as a pause that he's almost traumatized by this, but when the readers see it in the Sunday newspaper, they just continue on with their day. Themes, so we've got this idea that the readers are indifferent towards those who are suffering. The separation of the public from the reality of war. So because it's not going on in England, the readers feel very distant, very separated from what's going on. They don't really understand it. Contrast between the public reaction to the photographs and the private reaction of the war photographer, and obviously it's felt more deeply by him. Duffy's intentions then. So she criticises the readers for their lack of care. She's suggesting that these readers are insensitive and they need to be more proactive in helping those who are suffering, or just acknowledge their suffering in a deeper way. Then we've got this idea that war has become so large of an issue that we've almost become desensitised to it. So when we read about it in newspapers, see it on television, it's not really that much of a big deal when it should be. It should be an enormous deal to us that some countries are being torn by war. She encourages individuals to be appreciative and grateful for the luxuries that they have, that we have. And finally, she's suggesting that ultimately the war photographer's job is futile, it's pointless. He's not having an impact on his readers. They don't really care about his photographs, so why is he doing it? What's the point in that? Now, if we look at the structure of the poem as a whole, I just want you to think about the following questions and make some notes on that. So is there anything interesting about the rhyme scheme? rhyming couplets, the line length, the number of lines in a stanza, the number of stanzas, and is the structure regular? So does it follow a consistent pattern all the way through, or is it irregular? So if you pause the video now and make some notes on the overall structure. If we share our ideas then, the poem does have a very regular structure. We can see that it's got 4 stanzas, each having 6 lines and following an A, B, B, C, D, D rhyme scheme. So I'm going to show you how this works now. You can see in the first stanza that the first rhyming word is alone, which is an A rhyme. And then we've got rose and glows, which rhyming couplet there, BB rhyme. He is a C rhyme, and then mass and grass rhyme. So we've got a D rhyming couplet there. And that's consistent throughout the poem. So in the exam, there's no point in simply identifying a structural technique. You need to explain what that suggests. So this regular structure could represent his attempt to regain control and order over his life. It juxtaposes the disorder that he's experienced in war-torn countries, and he's trying to make sense of that and regain some order. The regularity also suggests that nothing will change. War photographers will continue to do their job and the general public will continue to be indifferent. This is going to be a regular occurrence. And finally, the poem takes the form of a cyclical structure. Starts with him returning home from a war to publish the photographs, and it ends with him leaving to do the same thing again. And this reflects that the nature of war is not going to change, and again emphasises the futility of his job. Now, we never look at a single poem in isolation, and this exam question is a comparative question, so we need to start to think about which poems would work well in a comparison essay with War Photographer. Now, here you can see a list of the poems in the anthology. You've not studied them all yet, but that's absolutely fine. Look at the ones that you have studied and make some notes on which ones would work well in a comparison essay with War Photographer. Now, I've just looked at one poem here, but the poem that stands out as being one that would compare really well with War Photographer is Remains by Simon Armitage. They're both about inner conflict and both about characters who are considering their own morality and the work that they're doing. So whilst a war photographer isn't actually a soldier who's killing people, he does have that same concern about his morality and what he's doing. So those two work really well together as a comparison. There's, of course, others that you might have said, but this is just one idea that you could note down. So that almost concludes our lesson today. If you want to aim high and do some extra independent study, here's a task that you might want to complete. Create a poster that makes comparative links between War Photographer and Remains. What is similar about the two poems? What is slightly different about the two poems? Include key quotation and consider and compare the use of language, themes and ideas, poet intentions and context, and structure and form. That's the end of our session. Well done everyone, and keep up the good work, and I hope you enjoyed the poem War Photographer by Carol and Duffy.